Hey guys, so with the new ban list, I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, gosh darn it, perhaps it's finally time to pick up Branded. And so, I thought I'd take this opportunity to go over some of the key basic plays of Branded Despia, as well as some of the key cards that you do have to be aware of, as well as interactions. And so, obviously post ban list, nothing's actually changed combo-wise in terms of Branded Despia because nothing got hit. But at the same time, I do understand, people on YouTube, they tend to want to search and want to watch the most recent combo guides available. And on top of that, of course, if you already know the basics of this deck, then you can also search or rather watch some of the other tip videos that I have made that are a little bit more intricate. I'll link all of those down below, but nonetheless, let's just get right into it. Alright, so as mentioned, let's just try to cover the most basics of Branded Despia, which basically the way it kind of works is that you're ideally trying to do two components of fusion plays, and the first component will be the Branded Fusion part, of course, but the other component is actually the Cartesia Fusion part, and that gets you Granule, which can typically dump the Gimmick Puppet, sometimes something else, but these are kind of what ideally you want to achieve. So now in terms of actually accessing Branded Fusion, there's a variety of ways. I mean, one is, of course, you just hard draw the Branded Fusion. Ideally, you also, maybe, for example, you have an Aluber that you can normal summon to search this or any Branded Spell Trap. If you don't have Branded Fusion, obviously, you're most likely going to be searching this. There are other instances where you might not, and you search High Spirits instead to kind of play around Ash a little better, but we're not going to cover that for this video. Now, in terms of getting access to Aluber, so that you can get access to Branded Fusion, will be something like, let's say, Branded Opening, right? You pitch a card, not for cost, by the way, and then you can special summon in defense mode and add the Branded Fusion. And also, a different way is something like, let's say, Foolish and Gold Sark, because this, you can dump something like Tragedy, which if this is sent to the grave or if it's banished by a card effect, you're going to be able to add a Despia monster, which you can of course add Aluber. It can also add Clem as well, and that's sort of a different line. Technically, you also have something like Kit if you do play it. This can also search Branded Fusion, but you do have to add a card from your hand to the bottom of the deck. So the only time where this becomes useful is when, let's say, because it can also add from Graveyard as well as Banish, which Aluber cannot. Kit can be very good in the grind game as well. On top of that, Kit can actually be added off of a Branded Lost. And also, Kit can actually be a special summon if you control a fusion monster with the Albaz's material, either on the field or in the grave. So sometimes Kit can be, sort of quote-unquote better depending on the situation. But for the most part, Aluber is what you're trying to get to. Now, there's other ways to get the Branded Fusion, and that's sort of dumping it into the graveyard and getting it access that way. You have something like a combination of something like, Clem, Shrouded Dragon, Serenir, for example. Granule is another one that can kind of dump one of these two as well. But basically, you want to dump something like the Branded Retribution into the graveyard, and then now you also have to find a way to get Branded Fusion into the graveyard, because once these two are in the grave, you can banish this from the grave and then add this card back to your hand, or any other Branded Spell Trap, really. So this can dump Branded Spell Trap or Fallen of Albaz, and then this can also dump Fallen of Albaz or cards that mention it, basically. And then Serenir can also dump a Branded Spell Trap if this happens to go to the graveyard. So those are some of the other lines to get to Branded Fusion. That line of play, unfortunately, of course, you're kind of investing a lot into getting access to Branded Fusion in itself, and then you get Ash and, feels really bad. Sometimes you might just not have a choice. There are obviously perhaps some other intricate ways to getting Branded Fusion in different ways, or a combination of different ways, but I think those are the more key basic ones. Now, of course, we spoke about the other component of the Branded Despia play that we ideally want to do, and that is with Cartesia, and the best way to get access to that is, of course, Fusion Deployment by revealing Granule. It is not for cost, by the way, and then specialing out so that you don't burn your normal summon. Sometimes, let's say you do have it, you hard drew it, of course, that's another access, but the problem is, like, can you waste the normal on it? You can if you, for example, have a way to get to Branded Fusion, you maybe hard drew it, although in that respect, if you have Branded Fusion and Cartesia, would you normal summon Cartesia first? There's kind of pros and cons to either of those approaches. We're not going to cover that in this video. Although, if you do have Branded Opening, then yes, you can normal summon this and then go Opening so that you can search or rather summon Aluber, which gets you access to Branded Fusion. That plays around Imperm better, but of course it plays into Droll. But I think, especially for this deck, that is the safer option. There's also other different ways, of course. Basically, if you have a way to get like Fallen of Albaz or Shrouded Dragon, because it's treated as Albaz in field and grave, into the graveyard, and then you can like special this. There's different ways, right? You have something like High Spirits, the search off of Lost can also add this as well. And then if we were talking about Gold Sark earlier, if you Gold Sark this, you can also get access to Cartesia. But again, it kind of depends on if you have that Albaz engraved to ideally be able to special summon it, because a lot of times you probably already burned your normal on the Aluber. Now, in terms of what you're summoning off of Branded Fusion, I would say among these cards, of course, Mirror Jade is kind of a given between these two. But essentially, I would say probably by default, your default line is probably the Albion Branded Dragon, and that's sending light and dark, but it does require you to have like a dark on the field or in the grave, essentially for that to be ideal. The other times where you would summon Lubellion is especially in a case where you don't have any monster on the field and you just only have Branded Fusion. That's when I find Lubellion is probably the best to go, and there's obviously other scenarios where all of these can come up. Really depends, but I'm just trying to cover the basics here, and of course either of these two you're probably making something like Mirror Jade. You also have Sanctifier. Sometimes you do make this off Branded Fusion as well. Kind of depends on like your hand, and it might just end up being like the simplest way to gimmick locking and also playing under Nibiru, for example, but this deck can play around and through Nibiru very, very well. These ones probably don't come up as much in terms of Branded Fusion specifically. If you are making this, you're probably sending Lubellion as well, which is a common theme for Albion as well, but it does, you know, sometimes let's say there's like a bigger kind of tower attack monster but not too high attack. This can get to, I believe, 37, so you know, from that you can kind of attack over it. It's unaffected by like extra deck monsters for that turn, affects it rather, and then you can also send it to the graveyard with Lubellion, get access to loss, and this will also have an end phase trigger. Almost never are you actually making this nowadays. There is at least one scenario I can tell you later in the video of why you would make this depending on your hand. For the most part, this is being sent off of Mirror Jade, so you can Rindbrumm and special that Albaz Engrave, and then just like, you know, fuse away your opponent's monsters on their turn. Alright, so let's just cover the first scenario, which is sort of like your ideal scenario, and then we'll cover some of the other basic scenarios as well. And that is when you have access to that Branded Fusion, as well as a fusion deployment line that I mentioned for the Cartesia part of the fusion. So in this instance, you would of course start with a fusion deployment, reveal Granule, and special out the Cartesia. Now you are safe from Imperm, unless you have double Imperm, then you know, too bad I guess. You normal Deluber, you use its effect, and you search the Branded Fusion. Now at this point, you're going to of course rip off and fire that Branded Fusion. And here, in terms of what you send, as I mentioned, the default line usually is going for the Albion line, but again, that is when you have like a dark to spare in terms of your field or grave, sometimes in the hand, and I'll get to, maybe I won't get to that in this video. There's some intricacies there, but anyways, so here you're sending Albion, Albaz, as well as Lubellion. And again, keep in mind in this case, you still have 3 other cards in hand that I'm not showing here. So let's say you summon the Albion, and then you're going to use its effect to fuse. So you banish the Aluber as well as the Albaz, that's the dark, and you're going to summon the Lubellion here, and then you're going to pitch a card. Now you have 2 extra cards left. In this case, you're going to shuffle this back into the deck as well as the Lubellion here, and you're going to make Mirror Jade. Usually I try to put in the extra Meso Zone, but considering the lack of space, let's just put it here anyways. Okay, so here now in open game state, you are going to put the Albaz, or rather Albion, into the graveyard so you can summon the Lubellion, and then you're going to use Lubellion's effect to place that Branded Lost, which is why sending Albion is very nice and kind of like your quote-unquote default option, because getting access to this really, really makes it strong for you. So now at this point, you're going to go Cartesia effect to fuse, and now you can go into something like Granule. And so now you have triggers. You're going to use that effect to dump, and you're also going to use Branded Lost effect to add. This is where, in this example, we do not have Albaz Engrave, and so that's why you would add something like Shrouded Dragon. But if you, depending on your hand, maybe you found a way to pitch off the Albaz, and you can search something else. But now you also send that Gimmick Puppet with Granule. So now, in this case, we are going to have to use Albion just to dump an Albaz into the grave. You would put it to the bottom of the deck. You'd also draw 1 extra card, and at this point, so basically I should have mentioned you still have like 2 extra cards in hand at this point, right? Anyways, so you have another blank draw. So now you can go right into the end phase. So you kind of have a couple triggers, and we're going to talk about triggers at the maybe the last part of the video. That's going to set the Branded in red, and then you'll have something like Cartesia that can also add back to your hand. So now this is kind of like your sort of like, I guess, as default standard as it can when it comes to like gimmick locking with the hand that you had. There's different ways, and I'll get to that in a second, but basically on your opponent's turn, if you were to go Branded in red, you basically have something like that you target the Albaz with. You can either summon it with the Cartesia you added from the hand. You can also use Granule if you wish. In this instance, let's just go with like these 2. Granule can be kind of nice, especially in the instance where we don't have access to Quem, and this can potentially tag out later for that Quem, which is always nice to have. And then you can summon something like the Sanctifier, and because of loss, we're also protected right now, so you would essentially go Chainlink 1 Lost to add, and then Chainlink 2, you basically have, you know, something like Gimmick, In this case, we did summon this properly, so these are the only 2 targets. You obviously cannot summon Lubellion, and so basically you give this to your opponent and they're locked for the rest of your turn. In terms of specialing, you also have the Mirror Jade. There's a different way to do this as well with the same hand that we had. You can always make like Sanctifier on your own turn. That way you save the Branded Red for the Guardian Chimera play, in terms of, you know, being able to pop, let's say, back row as the opponent tries to end, because you've already Gimmick locked them. So there are different ways. I'm just trying to cover some of the more basic lines. So now let's cover the less ideal scenario when you only have a Luber and then, like, let's just say 4 blanks, you know, like we're talking like double Imperm, double Ash, something that you can't really do anything with. In that case, to be honest with you, it's not that amazing with just a Luber, because let's say you normal Luber, you search the Branded Fusion and you're going to activate it. And again, as I said, by default, you may tend to go with the Albion line. And so let's just kind of cover what ends up happening. So because we do have a Dark Despair, we can go for the Albion line. So let's say you go Albaz and the Lubellion, you summon the Albion, and then let's say you same thing as the last time, you're gonna get rid of these, banish it to summon the Lubellion, and then you pitch a card that you have, and then you basically fusion summon back and you go into Mirror Jade. So now one thing, okay, so let's say same thing, you go into Lubellion here and you use its effect and you place Branded Loss. Some things to consider in this scenario, because for example, in your end phase, if you were to set Branded in red, it becomes useless here because you no longer have that Despia monster or Albaz in grave. So that's where it can get kind of tricky when you only have a Luber to deal with. Because for example, right, Branded red will probably be dead. Technically, you can set something like Branded Retribution, which is something that, you know, ideally you're going to want to have to use Mirror Jade effect first on the opponent's turn, and then if it comes up, use this, negate like a special summon or whatever. So that can come up. The other option actually is also in the end phase, just add Branded Opening, and in the same end phase you would pitch a card just so you can something special, something like Quem, dump like, I don't know, Albaz or Cortesia even, for some potential future plays in the opponent's turn. The other thing is, if you play Branded Banishment, that could be another option that would come up, especially like a Branded Mirror. That would actually be very good. Back in the days when we had Branded Expulsion, that was kind of one of the things we could set, and this situation didn't really matter. Now, of course, in that situation, or rather in that hand, you could have also what used to happen is when people played Adlib, you would send actually like something like Tragedy and something like, you know, Albaz, of course. You add the Adlib off of a Tragedy, and then you would even like use Mirror Jade on your own turn. But because you would have let's say like a Tragedy engrave for the Albion's Branded in red, you can kind of like make your fusion plays, and then when Adlib's banished, you can bring back that Mirror Jade and it has its banish again. But I think for the most part, people are not playing Adlib right now, so that's the only reason why, you know, maybe you wouldn't do that play. So you do have to kind of consider when you only have a Luber, it doesn't become that ideal. So you can kind of go either the Albion way or the Lubellion way, depending on what you play. Now, the other scenario to consider is if you only have Branded Fusion and, you know, just the 4 blanks, because in that case, it does differ in terms of what you send, because you can no longer, I mean, you can, but you shouldn't send Lubellion and Albaz to go into Albion, because that means you have no Dark to really go into like something like Lubellion or even Mirror Jade, so you end up having to like banish the Albion itself, in which case you have just no other place, and it's just really dumb thing to do. So don't do that. So in this case, when you only have Branded Fusion, you would ideally send something like Albaz and also Tragedy, and now you're actually summoning a Lubellion directly. You're gonna go Chainlink 1 Lubellion, you're gonna discard a card and then Chainlink to Tragedy to add. In this case, now you have the option to add essentially either a Luber or Quem. So if you were to add a Luber, you'd probably search Branded in red, for example, so that you have some kind of future plays. If you go with the Quem route, in this case, you can sort of, for example, dump like something like a Cortesia that might come up in the future, or something even like Albaz as well. So there's, I guess I'm not sure if there's really a right or wrong answer. It also depends on the kind of deck that you're playing. For example, that Branded red Guardian Chimera pop, if it is important, then you would want to go for the Aluba line and search like the Branded red later. Of course, we first need to resolve the Lubellion first, in which case, you know, you're adding that back and summoning the Mirror Jade. And again, depends on what you add. You either add a Luber or Quem from that Tragedy search, so you have another interruption on top that you can search potentially with, like, let's say Branded red, or with Quem you might send something like Cortesia, Albaz. There are different options, and if you were to dump something like, you know, Cortesia, for example, let's say on your opponent's turn, if you Mirror Jade, you know, a card left to extra deck, Quem can trigger, bring back the Cortesia. You can go into Granule, have like kind of some follow-up as well. So when you only have Branded Fusion, or when you have only a Luber, it is honestly not that amazing, but at least still sneakily good, I guess. Alright, so finally let's cover one other example where I mentioned, the rare instances where I would hard make Rindbrumm. So let's kind of cover that, and that's when you actually have a Luber or like access to Branded Fusion and Lubellion specifically, and you don't have access to Cartesia directly, something through like, let's say, Fusion Deployment. In that case, this is what I could do. So you would start with the normal Luber, just so you don't play hard into Droll as much if you start with Lubellion, and then you can go Lubellion, and you're gonna search the Serenir. So now in this case, now you can go Branded Fusion, and this is where you can send something different. So you can send Albaz as well as a Merc, and you would summon something like the Rindbrumm. So in this case, you would now go Serenir effect, targeting the Mercury to banish, and you would special it, and now Mercury, because it was banished, it's going to trigger, and you can add something like the Cartesia here. Now at this point, first, let's say you go into Lubellion here, by getting rid of that Serenir effect's going to trigger, and you can dump something like Branded Retribution. And then you can go Lubellion effect, and you place that Branded Loss. And because you still have that Branded, or rather Albaz, in the graveyard, because unlike, Albion or Lubellion, you're not putting it, or banishing it or getting rid of it. So you can now actually trigger Cartesia, special it. From here, you can use Cartesia effect to special. Let's say if you didn't have a Luber, you would just use this. Really, get the Despia to grave, I guess, especially. This can be a little bit more expendable. So now, here, you make something like Granule. And so now you can go Chainlink 1 Granule, Chainlink 2 Lost to add. And so if you play Kit, you can also add Kit as well. Let's just assume you don't. Not everyone does, realistically. So basically, this can add something like this, and then the Granule can add, or rather dump, the Gimmick Puppet. So now, from here, you can go... Albion effect, you can pitch something like Branded Red. You don't have to, but you'll draw a card, and then of course, understanding you still have like 3 more cards at this point as well. So now, if you look in your grave, you can also go now Retribution, and you can target that Branded Red, and then you can just set it for the next turn. So at this point, you're not going to get Cartesia back, unfortunately, but if you sort of look, let's say your opponent's turn rolls around, right? Like, you can go with Branded Red. Technically, you could have done it on your own end phase as well, but you can manage to get another search if you do it on your opponent's turn. So here, you're going to be able to target the Fallen of Albaz, and because it's still a spellcaster, you can use these two. And you can make something like Sanctifier, and then again, you would go 1 Lost, and then 2 Sanctifier. In this case, you are protected, and you can give them, a Gimmick Puppet. You can give yourself something like a Luber, so you can just search Branded Fusion again, and just have follow-up as well. So that's kind of like the rare instances where I think you would make Rindbrumm. It actually has a pretty decent effect, on-field effect as well. And then, of course, we've already spoke about that Graveyard effect. Alright, now to cap off the video, I also want to cover some key effects that you have to, try to make sure that you don't forget to trigger, because there's a lot of those in Branded Despia, unfortunately, and that's one of the things I felt was really hard when I first picked up this deck, because there were too many effects I would forget. First, let's start with like end phase triggers. Like Albion is the most common one, right? Like in terms of, setting like that Branded Spell Trap, you can also add as well. Titanic Clad can also add or summon like Fallen Valbaz, or something like Quem, and Lulu summoning something like Cartesia. But you know what? There's also a bunch of different, of course, fusion monsters, referring to Albaz, that can have a lot of these different end phase triggers that you really don't want to miss out on. Just every end phase, make sure you check your grave and see if you have any triggers, but also at the same time, just make sure you're not triggering when they weren't even sent that turn. The Mirage Nuke effect, I think that's another really easy one to forget, especially when, it's not just when it's destroyed, even if it's banished, even if it's Kaiju, you can actually still trigger Mirage's Nuke effect. Now, should you trigger it every time? Almost always. There are some rare exceptions I've come across where it was actually better not to trigger it, and that kind of involves like Promethean Princess and just leaving them on board so that they're fire locked. Honestly though, it's super niche. Realistically, just don't forget that effect, and also even if you declare that effect, remember to resolve it once it hits the end phase. So that is something that's going to be easy to forget. The other end phase trigger, of course, Cartesia and High Spirits. If a fusion monster, of course, hit the grave that turn, you're going to be able to add it in the end phase, even if the fusion monster, let's say, just got banished right away after it got sent to the graveyard. It's still going to remember, it's still going to be able to add. The only thing with High Spirits, of course, you do have to remember, you can only use one of the 2 effects in terms of its add effect. So if you did that one, then you cannot add it from the grave, but it's always nice to have this kind of recursion. Now, there's some other effects that you're going to have to try to remember as well that can be easily forgotten. One of them is Aluber's Graveyard effect. When like a fusion monster leaves the field, then you can actually special this from the grave and then target a monster on the opponent's field and negate that effect. So, and also keep in mind, if you do that, you cannot use its search effect. You can only use one of the 2. Otherwise, it'd be pretty strong. And also, this is pretty easy to forget, especially in the case where it's not just a fusion monster being destroyed, but let's say they got spun back to the extra deck. You can still trigger Aluber's Graveyard effect in that instance as well. And this can come up particularly clutch in decks that can play something like Access Code Tucker. When they don't pay attention of this being in the grave, they'll like pop your fusion, and then you can bring this back, negate the access code, and you're probably gonna survive. So this can be pretty clutch. The other effect that's pretty easy to forget is Granule's special summon effect. Basically, if your opponent special summons a monster using a monster effect, you can banish this. You can you have a couple targets. For example, there's Quartus from the extra deck. There's also Lulu from the extra deck if you did not use Branded Fusion that turn, where you're locked out of Synchro, for example. A lot of times you're probably summoning Quem, which then dumps something like Albaz. That can get things going. If it's your turn, potentially you might even summon something like Maximus and kind of pop off from there if you didn't have much plays going. One thing to note though is that with Granule, like basically just try to remember a lot of the common series that's going to come up so that you don't really forget. Poplar Summon is a very common one in this current format where you're going to be able to trigger this. Other examples are something like Nibiru. You're going to be able to trigger this after, you know, they summon like the Nibiru token and everything. And also any Bestials, you're also going to be able to trigger this if they summon a Bestial. So those are the most common ones, I would say. And there's obviously, you just have to keep an eye out for different decks. The Branded Opening Protection is also another easy one that is, you know, very easy to forget. So this can provide that protection, which is actually sneakily pretty good, especially in the mirror when your opponent has triggered their Mirror J nuke effect. You being able to protect is really nice. Sanctifier, while it does have target protection, you can actually just get rid of it easily with like a Regeki unless you have opening. So that's actually quite nice to have and something to remember. Masquerade, if you are playing it, remember you can bring it back again, like special from the grave if your opponent has whatever one of the monsters listed. Although keep in mind, if it does come back that way, it's not gonna burn. It's only burning if it was fusion summoned. So, but at the same time, it kind of builds a wall. But if it does remove, if it does get removed from the field after it comes back, it is banished. Keep that in mind. Other triggers to keep, or not triggers for Rindbrumm, but Quem. This one's also something you have to be always mindful of. If a card leaves the extra deck, you can trigger it, bring it back, and it can come up in weirder scenarios. Like let's say your opponent starts a turn with Pot of Prosperity, that still counts as card leaving the extra deck, and that gives you an opportunity to, let's say, bring back that Cartesia, which might help you pop off. And also something like, you know, whenever like obviously a monster summon from the extra deck, that's where you really have to keep in mind. And Rindbrumm, of course, this is probably something, you know, you're probably not going to forget this one, really. And only your opponent's turn, though, you can use this effect. Let's say special Albaz in your grave and just freeze away for, ideally, a Mirror Jade. Alright guys, so that was it for the basics of Branded Despia. Hopefully you did find that helpful and, you know, you're excited to play this deck moving into this new format. Definitely there's other tip videos that I've made that you can check out if you want to learn a little bit more about the deck in terms of, you know, some key rulings and interactions that you have to be aware of. Other than that, a huge thanks to all of you for watching. Big thanks to my patrons and sponsors as always, and well, take care guys.